He leaned over the map and said, "If we keep moving, they don't recover." Eisenhower didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, he just looked at the map and replied, "We can't change the plan now." Patton didn't hesitate. Then they survived this war. That was the moment. Not the order, not the halt. The moment Eisenhower understood exactly what Patton was trying to do and decided not to let him do it. The truth had been spoken clearly and set aside anyway. By late August 1944, the Western Front did not look like a front at all. It looked like a collapse that hadn't decided whether it was allowed to happen. German units were retreating in pieces, not organized withdrawals, fragments, columns without air cover, divisions bleeding vehicles and men as they moved east. American patrols were driving through towns that had been marked contested just days earlier. Roads were open, bridges were intact, resistance appeared only after pauses. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than anyone had planned for, including the people who wrote the plan. And that was the problem. The Allied strategy had been built on balance, equal pressure across the front, shared progress. No one army racing too far ahead of the rest. It sounded safe, it sounded reasonable, it sounded controlled. But wars don't reward neat plans, they reward timing. Patton understood something simple. Once an enemy starts pulling back without control, every hour matters. Every mile taken at speed denied the Germans time to regroup. Every pause gave them a choice, to dig in, to reorganize, to survive. Inside headquarters, reports piled up. Not dramatic reports, boring ones. German units disengaging before contact. Rear guards holding briefly, then disappearing. Captured officers admitting they had no orders except, "Get east." This wasn't resistance, it was escape, and the map showed it. Red arrows pushed forward faster than the blue ones behind them could support. Supply officers warned about fuel. Staff officers warned about overextension. All the usual warnings, but something else was becoming obvious. Patton's logic was holding. Every time he was slowed, German resistance hardened ahead of him. Every time he pushed, the enemy dissolved. This was the trap. The Allies believed they were being cautious. In reality, they were deciding whether to let a broken enemy recover. The window Patton had warned about, the one everyone dismissed as impatience, was now visible, and it was closing. Eisenhower could see it. That's the part people get wrong. He wasn't blind. He wasn't confused. He wasn't ignoring the reports. He was reading the same numbers Patton was reading, the same battlefield summaries, the same prisoner interrogations, the same signs of an army trying to survive, not fight. The difference was not information, it was fear. Not fear of the Germans, fear of what happened if the plan broke. If Patton was unleashed, balance vanished. If balance vanished, Montgomery would be sidelined. If Montgomery was sidelined, British confidence fractured. If British confidence fractured, the alliance cracked. And Eisenhower had been chosen for one reason above all others: to hold the alliance together. So the question in that room was never really about Patton. It was about control. Could the war be won faster if Patton was right? Yes. Could it still be won if the alliance fractured? No one knew. And that uncertainty terrified Eisenhower more than a retreating enemy. So when Patton said, "They don't recover if we keep moving," Eisenhower didn't deny it. He simply decided that some truths were too dangerous to act on. That decision would not explode immediately. There would be no dramatic collapse, no headline screaming disaster. The war would continue, just slower, heavier, more expensive, and that cost would come due later. By early September 1944, the problem was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Patton's army was not just advancing. It was outpacing expectations. Units that planners expected to fight for every mile were driving through empty towns. German checkpoints were abandoned. Roadblocks were thin, rushed, improvised. This was not how a confident army fought. It was how an army tried to survive. Patton's message did not change. It never had. Speed kills options, delay creates them. He did not argue that fuel was unlimited. He argued that fuel problems were temporary, but lost momentum was permanent. If the Germans were given time, they would do what they had always done well. They would reorganize. They would choose terrain. They would turn rivers and cities into killing zones. Patton had seen it before, in North Africa, in Sicily, at every moment where an enemy was allowed to recover. He wasn't guessing. Inside Allied headquarters, the mood was different. The success itself was becoming uncomfortable. Patton was too far ahead, too fast, too visible. Supply officers pointed to numbers, fuel consumption, truck wear, road congestion. They weren't wrong, but their warnings all assumed one thing, that the enemy would still be there tomorrow. Patton did not believe that. He believed tomorrow was exactly what the Germans were trying to buy. And the more Patton succeeded, the more pressure built behind the scenes. Montgomery's front was moving slower, carefully, deliberately. That had been the agreement. No one nation would dominate the advance. No one commander would steal the war. The plan was balance, and Patton was breaking it without asking permission. That made Eisenhower's position harder by the day, because Eisenhower was not commanding one army. He was managing egos, governments, newspapers, and fragile trust. Patton's speed embarrassed other commands. It raised questions no one wanted asked. Why were some armies stuck while others raced forward? Why did Patton need fewer pauses? Why did his casualties stay lower during advances? Those were dangerous questions. Questions that threatened the structure Eisenhower was trying to protect. And then the reports started to align with Patton's predictions. German officers captured east of the Seine described the same pattern. They were ordered to retreat, not counterattack. They were told to save equipment, not ground. They spoke of buying time. Buying time for what? For new lines, for new orders, for winter. Every delay on the Allied side showed up days later as stronger resistance ahead. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was cause and effect. Patton sent message after message arguing the same point. Not emotional appeals, operational logic. Give him fuel now. Accept risk now. End the war sooner. Each message landed on Eisenhower's desk with the same problem attached. If he agreed, he had to explain why Patton deserved what others did not. If he disagreed, he had to accept what delay would cost. And Eisenhower hated decisions that forced visible winners and losers inside his own alliance. That was the power struggle. Patton was fighting the Germans. Eisenhower was fighting collapse. One wanted motion, the other wanted control, and both believed they were saving lives. By mid-September, the window Patton talked about was no longer wide. It was narrow. German resistance was stiffening in predictable places. Cities that could have been bypassed were preparing defenses. Rivers were becoming lines instead of obstacles. Patton saw the shape of the future forming, and for the first time, Eisenhower saw it too. That was the escalation. Not shouting, not rebellion, but two commanders realizing they wanted opposite outcomes, and only one of them was going to get what he wanted. The confrontation did not happen in a single argument. It happened in pieces. It happened through reports that stopped contradicting Patton, through prisoner statements that kept repeating the same theme, through German movements that made sense only if Patton's warnings were true. By the third week of September, the evidence was stacked neatly in front of Dwight D. Eisenhower. German units were not choosing to fight. They were choosing where not to fight. They were giving up ground that mattered less, holding ground that mattered more, trading space for time. This was not improvisation, it was method, and method meant intention. Eisenhower read the summaries carefully, not quickly, not defensively. He understood what they meant. Patton had not been exaggerating. The enemy really was vulnerable, but only while moving, only while disorganized, only before new lines hardened. The logic was simple. If the Allies kept pressure uneven and slow, Germany would survive long enough to make the war harder. If they concentrated speed where the front had broken, they could end it sooner. This was the last moment to fix it. Resources could still be shifted, fuel could still be prioritized, orders could still be rewritten. Nothing irreversible had happened yet. And that was the problem. Reversing course meant admitting something that could not be unsaid, that the carefully balanced Allied plan was now the obstacle. Eisenhower did not reject Patton's argument. He absorbed it. He sat with it. And then he asked the question Patton never did. What breaks if I say yes? Montgomery's method had been defended publicly. British leadership had invested prestige in it. A sudden pivot toward Patton would be read as judgment, not just of a general, of a nation. Eisenhower knew how quickly resentment spread inside coalitions. He had seen it before the war ever reached Europe. A commander favored today becomes a liability tomorrow. And Patton was already a liability. He spoke too freely. He embarrassed allies. He created headlines Eisenhower had to clean up. Giving him more authority now would not quiet him. It would amplify him. Inside meetings, Eisenhower did not argue with Patton's numbers. He questioned the consequences. What happens if Patton outruns his support and stalls anyway? What happens if another front collapses while resources are diverted? What happens if British commanders lose faith in the balance Eisenhower promised? These were not excuses. They were risks. And Eisenhower had been selected precisely because he took risks seriously. Patton saw only one danger: letting the enemy breathe. To George S. Patton, the math was brutal and clear. Every day delayed now would be paid back later in blood. He pointed to German behavior: retreats turning into defenses, delays turning into fortresses. He pressed again: if we don't move now, we fight them later on their terms. Eisenhower did not argue. He did something more final. He let the moment pass. No order expanding Patton's fuel. No directive changing the plan. No announcement. Just continuity. The plan stayed intact. And with that decision, the confrontation ended. Not because one side won the argument, but because one side controlled the authority. The point of no return did not look dramatic. There was no single signature that doomed the opportunity, just silence. And silence, in war, is a decision. The cost did not arrive all at once. That is what made it easy to ignore at first. There was no sudden disaster, no single battle that screamed mistake. no headline that forced reconsideration. Instead, the war thickened. By late September, the roads that had been open were no longer empty. German units that had been running were now digging. Not everywhere, but in the places that mattered. Cities that could have been bypassed became obstacles. River lines that should have been crossed in motion became walls. Each pause gave the enemy exactly what Patton warned it would: time. German engineers worked while the Allies waited. Concrete went into the ground, guns were sighted, fields were mined. This was not brilliance, it was survival. And survival was enough. Patton watched it happen in real time. He could see the pattern forming ahead of his advance. Every mile that had once cost nothing was now paid for. Not because the Germans were stronger, but because they were prepared. He wrote about it, not in public speeches, in private frustration. Speed had been replaced by permission, momentum by paperwork. Meanwhile, Allied casualties began to climb, quietly. Not in one place, but everywhere the enemy had been allowed to settle. Assaults became deliberate instead of opportunistic. Attacks required planning instead of instinct. Artillery was used to break positions that should never have existed. This was the hidden price. Eisenhower saw it too, but by now the system had locked itself in. Fuel was still rationed. Fronts were still balanced. No single army was allowed to dominate. The plan was working in the narrow sense. The alliance held. The newspapers stayed calm. No commander openly revolted. But the war slowed into something uglier. Weeks turned into grinding fights. September turned into October. October bled into November. German resistance, which should have collapsed, hardened instead. And then winter came. The Ardennes did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of time that had been bought. German units that escaped in August and September did not vanish. They regrouped. They rearmed. They waited. The counterattack that shocked the Allies in December was not magic. It was preparation. Preparation made possible by delay. Patton understood that better than anyone. When the crisis hit, he moved again, fast. He pivoted. He reacted. But this time, he was not exploiting collapse. He was paying a bill. A bill that had been postponed, not canceled. Eisenhower would later be praised for holding the line, for managing the crisis, for restoring balance. All of that is true. What is also true is this: the war became harder than it needed to be. More men died than needed to die. Not because the enemy was unbeatable, but because the enemy had been given time to choose where to fight. This was the cost of restraint. Not immediate failure, but accumulated blood. And by the time the full weight of that decision was felt, there was no way back. The war had crossed its own threshold. Speed was gone. Only endurance remained. History rewarded Eisenhower. That is the first truth. He won the war. He kept the alliance together. He prevented public fractures that could have spiraled out of control. Those things mattered. Without Eisenhower, the Allied command might not have survived its own success. But history also blurred something else. There was a day when the right answer was visible. Not guessed, not debated, visible. The enemy was retreating in disorder. German generals later admitted it. Post-war interrogations confirmed it. They were not holding a line, they were buying time. Patton saw it first, then others saw it, and finally Eisenhower saw it. That is the part people are uncomfortable with. Eisenhower did not stop Patton because he thought Patton was wrong. He stopped him because acting on that truth carried a different kind of risk. A political risk, a coalition risk, a command risk. Eisenhower chose certainty over speed. Not certainty of victory, certainty of control. That choice shaped everything that followed. It shaped where the war slowed, where it hardened, where it bled. It shaped who reached which cities first, which borders froze in place, which armies paid the final cost. Patton never forgot that moment. In his later writings, he returned to the same idea again and again. Speed was not recklessness. It was protection. Momentum denied the enemy choices. Delay handed those choices back. Patton believed, with reason, that the war could have ended sooner. Not cleanly, not without cost, but sooner. And sooner meant fewer funerals. Eisenhower never publicly conceded that point. He didn't need to. From his perspective, the alliance survived. Germany fell. The mission was accomplished. But the shadow of that decision lingered. It lingered in the Ardennes. It lingered in the final drive into Germany. It lingered in the political map of Europe that hardened after the guns went quiet. The cost of delay was not just measured in casualties. It was measured in consequences that lasted decades. This is where history usually softens. It says both men were right in their own way. That war is complicated. That hindsight is unfair. But that is not true here. This was not hindsight. This was foresight that went unused. Eisenhower understood the logic. He saw the pattern. He read the same evidence Patton did. And he chose not to act. Not because he didn't know, but because he knew and decided that holding the system together mattered more than correcting it. That is not cowardice. It is something more troubling. It is the moment when leadership chooses stability over truth. And once that choice is made, everything that follows belongs to it. The war was won, but it was won slower than it needed to be. And the people who paid for that delay did not sit in conference rooms. They fought in them. That is why this decision still matters. Not because Eisenhower failed, but because he succeeded and still left a cost behind.